Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Skidmore. I'm the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, and the NCRCRD is sponsoring a webinar series on community impacts of energy development, which is an NSF-funded research coordination network. And today we have as the topic, Synergies and Innovations in Coordinating Research on the Community Impacts of Renewable Energy. And the three researchers presenting are Claire Haggett, a sociologist from University of Edinburgh, Ben Haen, an economist from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and Dustin Mulvaney, State University. And before we get started on the webinar itself, Julia Haggerty, the Research Network co-chair, is going to talk a little bit and introduce more about what the group is doing. And so I'll hand it off to Julia, and then we'll get to the presentation.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Julia Haggerty here at Montana State. So as Mark mentioned, this is a research coordination network that's funded by the National Science Foundation, and we're in the end of the first of 3 years of this work. And we're really focused on, as you can tell, coordinating research across the social sciences with a focus on the communities and landscapes that host energy infrastructure really in all of its manifestations. And when we established this research coordination network, which Dr. Jeffrey Jaquette and I did with a wonderful steering committee, our goal was really to explore the new directions and discoveries that are possible the many disciplines in the social sciences that are looking at community impacts of energy development. So this webinar series is part of that work, and you can see here on the title slide a nod to what's happening in next year. In February of 2017, we're really excited that we're going to have some highlights of new and emerging scholarship from graduate students, and on April 13th, we'll be organizing and hosting a webinar focused on energy law and policy research. So put those on your calendar. And then in addition to this webinar series, we have a number of other activities that we're excited about. And taking the two that are on the slide that's in front of you now, we have an Energy Impact Symposium, which is really the first of its kind, certainly in the United States, that is scheduled for July of 2017. And that'll be hosted in Columbus, Ohio, and we're super excited to get researchers from across the social science disciplines and who range from really applied to basic research on energy impacts to this conference. So be sure to check out the website for that and submit an abstract if you haven't already. And then we also encourage you to check out our researcher directory, which is a database of researchers working in this space that is not only limited to North America, but is increasingly worldwide. So Mark's done a great job of giving us an overview of what we're going to talk about today, and I won't go into lengthy bios for our three speakers, but we're super excited to have this distinguished panel here today. And of course, we're selling them short by only giving them each really 8 to 10 minutes to kind of do a greatest hits reel of what they're excited about in their discipline and emerging work on renewable energy. And that's really so that we can save time questions and general discussion, and again with this goal of trying to think about how we begin to synthesize and find new synergies by looking outside of our disciplines to people working on similar issues. So one question I had for Mark and Rosa before we get going is if we could just tell the audience how to expect to submit questions when we get to the end. Are we doing that by typed questions or by audio or both?
Yeah, this is Mark. So the way in which the audience can ask questions is through the chat, and so I would just remind the participants that if as the discussion moves along, if you have a question or a comment, you can just add it to the chat session, and then the presenters can kind of keep an eye on that, and you can answer those questions along the way or at the end when we have some extra time, whatever seems to kind of fit the flow of your work and your presentation.
Okay, so thanks, Mark. We'll leave it to the presenters to think about if they can address the questions. My guess is that mostly we should hold them to the end because people have such limited time as it is. And the first speaker that we have today is Dustin Mulvaney. Dustin's at San Jose State and currently on sabbatical at the Bill Lane Center at Stanford. So Dustin, we'll let you take it away. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And let's make sure I got this control down a little better. Oops, I went a little too far there. Let's see. Okay, great. So what I'm going to talk about, first of all, everybody can hear me good? Okay. So I'm going to talk about my work as a qualitative social scientist who also has a little bit of training in the sustainability sciences. So I do a little bit of work on the quantitative side using life cycle assessment. My primary research is in the social sciences, and as a human geographer probably best fits me, although I would consider myself a little more of a mutt than that, drawing from various social science disciplines. And maybe those are silos that are worth breaking for these kinds of questions anyway. But let me move ahead to the next slide. So where I root my human geography work is in political ecology. And I won't spend too much time here. There's a tremendous amount of scholarship on this, and they do a much better job synthesizing what political ecology is, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But let me just flag a couple of highlights. One is it's obviously interested in environmental change. Two, it's typically using case study methodology, which, as I point out here, is not very helpful for theory building in that sense. You can draw theories, but it's not necessarily theoretically driven case studies. And the kinds of case studies I'm going to talk about today are that the framework is commodity chain analysis. So essentially kind of mapping out the commodity system, tracing it, and looking for particular tensions or points of disagreement that warrant further explanation or uncovering or unveiling. Couple of things to point out. It's multi-method, meaning it's drawing on all sorts of different primarily qualitative social science methodologies, but also some geospatial sciences such as remote sensing, and what I've done in some of my work is incorporated the tools of life cycle assessment, at least into one of the cases I'll talk about. Because I'm using a commodity chain approach, it's often multi-sided, and a lot of political ecology is trying to link consumption to production. So that's another avenue to explore here. And I won't go into too many of the other details I have pointed out here, but as opposed to kind of finding the root of environmental problems in apolitical narratives about scarcity or poor management or a lack of investigation, political ecology work is really looking at power control questions, access to resources, institutional changes, and environmental controversies over the meaning and representation of the change itself. And in this sense, my own work is pretty much motivated by trying to uncover where there might be environmental justice considerations in these commodity chains. Now, the other area that I'm trying to draw on for this work is science and technology studies as well, and there's a few scholars, Rebecca Lave, I'll flag as one of them, who have tried to do the work of incorporating this political ecology framework, but also understanding of how science and technology studies might inform how we regulate emerging or technologies that are not necessarily, that we don't necessarily have the governing institutions set up to manage. And as part of that, there's a subsector that I would name for energy transitions, which is basically trying to identify what are the things that we can expect and anticipate with this, in this case, solar energy transition. So I'll skip ahead real quick. I'm going to just go through these relatively quickly now. My first question that I came up with looking into this particular space was over a controversy related to the use of cadmium in photovoltaics, right? So you have a toxic metal in a green product, and trying to understand what those implications might be, what that means for scaling of manufacturing facilities, right? If we're going to be putting more and more solar out there, what does that mean for increased chemical use or occupational exposure? And I found myself automatically inserted into this controversy, which actually had, as this slide notes down toward the bottom, had regulatory implications. There was a big debate about whether solar panels that have a certain level of toxic materials, in this case cadmium, would be even allowed to sell on the market. So exploring these, I started to look a little bit more and see how environmental sciences were trying to address this particular controversy, and it became even more controversial because not only is cadmium a toxic element used in photovoltaic manufacturing, it's actually a waste product of zinc mining, right? So it's like, how do you resolve these tensions about having a product that's potentially toxic but actually might be encouraged through other sustainability principles such as reusing waste? And through this work, I discovered there's a lot of work in life cycle assessment on that, and some of the conclusions that they had reached was that, you know, even though some of these PV modules have toxic metals in them, the amount of toxic metals per unit of energy produced was actually much, much lower than other alternatives. And because that cadmium is released through the combustion of coal, making crystalline silicon, which is your typical PV module, as opposed to these thin films that contain the cadmium that I'm talking about, actually would release more cadmium because you're using more energy. Now, that sounded like it settled the debate. On the previous slide, I showed you a quote from Greenpeace saying that they're concerned about it, and then this slide here in the lower left-hand corner kind of concludes that we shouldn't be worried about cadmium in there. However, if we really want to understand environmental justice impacts, the life cycle assessment approach isn't necessarily helping us understand that, because it's looking at kind of aggregated and cumulative impacts, whereas in facilities that are using cadmium, the exposures are much, much, much higher than would be kind of in a typical industrial park where you're exposed to cadmium. So point here is that you can use commodity chain analysis to find your way into some of these environmental controversies and use science and technology studies to kind of unpack some of the controversies over the way that the science is being quote-unquote settled. And then that can give you some better interpretation and guidance. So instead of saying, for solar energy transitions, so instead of saying, hey, this solar technology is much better than coal, instead you're focused on, okay, how can we minimize exposures of workers in the workplace environment to cadmium, et cetera. And then there's a couple other points that came up through interviews with others about how to protect workers from cadmium, et cetera. The other area that I'll talk about, and I just have 2 more minutes, is what we call the social gap in renewable energy deployment. And this is something that we'll get talked about a little bit later in our seminar here, which is that everybody wants renewable energy, but when it comes to citing particular projects, they typically get embroiled in some local controversy. Okay, and I've put a couple bullets here describing where this work is actually, some of the hypotheses that are used to explain this social gap. And I'll just show you a couple things. One of the things that was very interesting in following this particular commodity system into the Mojave Desert area was the extensive land use change that was taking place here. So in many cases, the literature was mainly speaking about wind, and many of the things I was seeing on the ground weren't quite fitting what that literature was telling us, because as you see on this slide, there are certain and real environmental impacts from solar energy facilities, and I won't belabor what those impacts you're seeing there, but you can see lots of desert tortoise being moved and mortality to birds and such from facilities. So it turns out that through this work you can slowly see where the controversy was taking place, which was mainly on public lands, which in the United States have been in default conservation for 100 years, because this controversy I never saw on private lands, not to the extent we saw it on the public lands. So that's just another point to look at here. Another area to investigate, I think, here is also looking at the development of institutions to manage these particular ecological controversies that were happening in the West. So there's a Western Solar Plan and a Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan that were set up to mitigate, and essentially using some geospatial science, but also ecological science and otherwise, try to identify more appropriate landscapes that would be that would minimize both the ecological controversy, but also kind of close that social gap we were talking about before. And if I were just to point out one thing about that literature that makes me somewhat uncomfortable, is that a lot of that literature seems to be framed on trying to convince the public that they're being irrational about the fears of renewable energy and the concerns. And I would just, if you have a moment to read this quote later on, it seemed to me from this research that activists and developers were kind of presented with a false set of choices here. There are more appropriate lands to build out. You just need to understand why the institutions were designed to promote renewable energy push them into particular controversial spots, and that's what I've tried to document through some of my work here. So a couple of just last points on how to make sure we do this a little more sustainably in terms of taking home points from this political ecology approach and trying to translate it into social planning for solar energy transitions, thinking more broadly about where do we site things, citing with no regrets, and using science to inform where we might regret siting solar power plants, and then finally better incentivizing more distributed and disturbed lands, because again, with a lot of the work that I've done, 80% of solar installed in California is on disturbed lands, and almost none of that ever is opposed by groups. So I'm sorry I went over, but I'll wrap it there, and you could look at the references, and I'm sure I'm missing people, but I look forward to talking later.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Dustin. I know it's just a bear to try to squeeze all of the great work that you're doing into such a short amount of time. But I think we'll turn it now over to Claire Haggett, who's a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Edinburgh, who wins the prize for the most delicious accent in our webinar today. And Claire, we'll let you take it away here.
Thanks very much, Julia. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much. Can I just check you can all hear me?
Sound great to me.
Wonderful. And Rosa, could you give me ability to be able to?
Okay, Claire, you'll select these arrows down here.
No arrow anymore.
Down on the bottom?
Nope.
Right.
Perhaps I could just say when it's time to move on to the next slide.
Okay, you're on your slide right there. Can you see it?
I can, that's wonderful.
Okay.
So I'm delighted to be joining you all from Scotland. It's a very dark, dreich, as we say in Scotland, evening tonight. I'm really pleased to be here because Scotland is in some ways one of the most interesting places to study renewable energy. So we are lucky enough, I think, to have a quarter of Europe's wind resource. We have huge amounts of wave and tidal resources. Not so much solar power here, not so much sunshine, but we have correspondingly some really ambitious targets. So the Scottish Government has the most ambitious targets across all of Europe for the generation of electricity from renewable energy. So in Scotland we have a really fascinating context in which to think about some of these questions. And sociology, I think, is a fascinating lens through which to try and understand renewables. So perhaps we could go on to the third slide now, please. So sociology is really about some of the big questions about the way in which we do things, the way in which we understand the world around us. It's about how change happens, who has power, how we are able to react against that, who has agency, who has the ability to be able to act, and how we interact with each other. So some really big questions. And I think that renewable energy developments are in many ways a microcosm of some of these really big questions. So if we're thinking about the siting of a new wind farm, for example, actually suddenly we're thinking about all of these big stuff. So we're thinking about who has the power to propose a new development, what might that development mean for people who live there, what ability do they have to get involved in the decision-making processes, why has this location been chosen, for what purposes. So a renewable energy development suddenly is a way of understanding issues around communication, around engagement, about what places mean to people, how they're valued, and what opportunity they have to try and express that. So I think what sociology can do is move beyond just thinking about attitudes, just thinking about the way in which someone might like something or not. I think sociology can give us a much more meaningful, a much deeper way of understanding people's responses, people's reactions to something like renewables. So perhaps if we could do the next slide, please. And I think what sociology can tell us is that, exactly as Dustin was just saying, there are impacts from renewable energy. Justin was rightly talking about some of the environmental impacts, and there are community, there are social impacts. So while, of course, renewable energy is good for the planet, of course, on a national, international level, clean, green, renewable energy from an endless source is a good thing, there are local disadvantages, so national, international benefits, but tangible and immediate and obvious disadvantages for people who might happen to live near a new development. And the proportional reduction in CO2 emissions that might happen from more wind energy is a very small and a very intangible benefit from someone who happens to live nearby. So next slide, please. So what sociology can tell us is a little bit about what motivates people, what understanding we have about their responses to living near something. And that doesn't mean that people who protest are NIMBYs. So Dustin mentioned this on one of his slides. NIMBY is this well-known acronym, stands for Not in My Backyard. And it's a great classic explanation of whenever anyone protests against something, it's assumed that, oh, they're just being a NIMBY. And this term has a lot of assumptions wrapped up in it that everyone wants this thing, be it solar farm, be it wind farm. They just don't want it near them, they want it somewhere else. And because they are somehow therefore obviously being a NIMBY, you can dismiss the claims that they have. Next slide, please. So what sociology has done is try and look a bit more deeply at what motivates protest. And it's found absolutely that whilst there certainly is protest, whether it can be safely categorised as NIMBY protest, not very much actual evidence of that. So what sociological research has found is that while people do protest, it's not necessarily because of their own selfish personal calculations. If they're concerned about local jobs, it's not normally their job, they're just concerned about other people's jobs. They're less selfish than perhaps this acronym might imply. If you're a NIMBY, well, that doesn't really take into account people who are NIABs, here we go, another acronym, NIAB, not in anybody's backyard. So people who are protesting against the technology more generally. And this is a terrain that is littered with acronyms. So you could be a NIMBY, you could be a NIAB, you could also be someone who wants to build absolutely nothing, absolutely nowhere near anyone. And for those of you who are keeping up, that's a banana. And if it's not a compliment to be called a NIMBY, it is certainly not a compliment to be called a banana. And that's part of the problem with this terminology, because it's always used in a derogatory sense and as a way of just dismissing opposition. So what sociology has very strongly argued is that rather than just dismissing opposition, rather than, as Dustin was talking to, rather than trying to explain to an irrational public that they must have this good thing, what sociology says is we can look much more meaningfully at the reasons why people protest. So, what has sociology found? Next slide, please. So, a sociological focus can tell us about the importance of the local social context in which people live. So, the sorts of things that have happened in any particular place, the local socio-economic, political history of a particular location will influence and inform the way in which people respond to a new development. And what that response will be different between different places, but there will be a response based on what has happened there. So the pictures at the bottom of that slide, the bottom left is Dorset in the south coast of England, and this is a World Heritage Site. It's a designated area of outstanding natural beauty. The Olympic London 2012 yachting took place in tourism, and these sorts of things that happen there affect how people were viewing the local offshore wind farm that was planned. The picture in the middle is Tiree, which is a very beautiful remote island, a Scottish island, and the thing about Tiree is that it is very remote. Very few people live there. It has a very traditional lifestyle and culture, and suddenly hordes of people descending because of a new offshore wind farm was seen as a real threat to the very identity of that place. The third picture is a place called Teesside, which is in the east, off the east coast of England. And actually, it's a fairly horrible place. It's a place which is inescapably scarred by industry. There's lots of polluting factories, asbestos. And so for the people who live there, looking out to sea was perhaps the one decent view they had left. So there were a lot of protests against the offshore wind farm that was planned there. So there are different things in each area, but all of them important to the people who live there. So thank you very much for moving down, that's perfect. So sociology can tell us about the importance of meaning to people who live in a particular place. And the NIMBY theory tends to assume that people are just parochial, selfish, uneducated. Actually, what our research has found is that people are very knowledgeable about the places in which they live, the places that matter to them. And they can have a very nuanced, a very deep understanding of the landscape that is around them. And that understanding very often isn't captured by the sort of environmental impact assessments that are more traditionally carried out. Next slide, please. So what we've done, some of the research that we've been doing here at Edinburgh, is trying to get a richer sense of what places mean, why they matter, and what sorts of characteristics make them important to people, characteristics that are very often not captured in traditional assessments. So the next slide shows the sort of normal assessment that's done of any particular landscape. I realise that the scale on the right looks fairly small. It's actually quite boring. You're not missing anything. It says things like arable, landscape, woodland, blah, blah, quite dull. The next slide shows some of the things that we were doing with people who lived in this landscape, lived and worked and knew this landscape, for whom it was really meaningful. So the slide above is about kind of the boring, bog standard way in which landscape is captured. The slide that we have with the pictures on, thank you, shows the way in which this landscape was actually used by people, how they lived in it. We think about this as a living landscape, not something that's just on a map. And the next slide again, thank you, shows the sort of way in which people found this landscape important to them. So we asked people to talk about particular memories, particular significance that certain places had and why they were important, to try and get that richer, more in-depth understanding of why place matters and how change to any place might be received. And I think the final point I'm going to make is about the way in which a project is planned. So Dustin was very interestingly talking about the importance of environmental justice, and these ideas speak to some of those broader issues around environmental justice and about the decision-making processes. And there's been some really fascinating sociological research which has found that process is as important as outcome. So it might not be that people are protesting against the wind farm, the solar farm. It might be they're protesting against the way in which that project is being planned. If they feel that it's been dumped on them by outsiders who don't care about their particular location, if they feel they haven't been involved in the decision-making processes. Stefan Damburg talks about the way in which a lack of communication is the perfect catalyst for creating opposition that wasn't there in the first place. So if people aren't involved, they're much more likely to protest, whether they like the project or not. Richard Hindmarsh in Australia talks about double speak, the idea that even if you do consult with people, actually you're just going through the motions. It doesn't really mean anything. And Catherine Gross fairly compellingly talks about fairness of process and outcomes. And what she means by that is that if people feel that the process has been fair, the decision-making processes, then they are much more likely to support, or at the very least not protest, against the outcome. So there's lots of really interesting things to say. That's been a very brief summary of them around the way in which a development happens, the process that gets us there. So just the last slide now, thank you so much. In summary, what sociology can give us is a rich understanding of the context in which people form their responses, in which they make their decisions. It tells us that local places are meaningful in a way in which to outsiders they might not seem like that. And it tells us about the that might come forth. So that's a very quick romp through some sociological thinking and some sociological understandings, and I'd be delighted to take some more questions at the end. Thank you all very much indeed.
So thanks, Claire, so much. I can tell that these presentations are going to fit together really quite nicely. But we'll turn it over now to Ben Haen from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and we'll look forward to this third installment, thinking about impacts from an economic point of view.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
You sound great.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. I just moved to a headphone microphone. This has been really interesting, and I want to, first, my name is Ben Hoen, not that it really matters, but I would say an econometrician. I use economic theory, though I should admit I'm not an economist, just to be clear on that. But some of the discussion today has been really important to understand the broad aspects of wind and solar developments that might occur in communities. I'm going to talk, it seems like, into a very narrow aspect of it. So with that frame, why don't I move forward here? And I guess I'll try to do the advancing of the slides. Let's see. Okay. So I'm going to briefly review some of the theory and talk about some examples of related research. So some of the methodologies that we tend to use when looking at impacts when thinking about economics have to do with stated preference methods, revealed preference methods, or regional or technology-specific economic models. For stated preference methods, often one would use those when there's a hypothetical situation. You're not exactly sure what impacts might exist, and you want to try to take the pulse of the individuals that might be impacted and put that in, or the price of electricity, things like that. For the revealed preference methods, generally these are applied after the fact when actions have been taken to try to better understand the impacts that have actually occurred. But extracting those values out of sort of other market goods that might display some of evidence of impact from the environmental change. And the regional and technology-specific economic models are really broad-based to look across a value chain or across a region to better understand the impacts. And I'm going to talk about each of those today. Let's see here. Okay, so now we're talking about some of the studies that we've done. This first study that I'll mention is looking at property value impacts. Now, this is extremely important in that, as Claire mentioned, the impacts are not distributed evenly across space. And those that live quite close to the turbines, for instance, or solar facilities, are likely to be impacted at a much different amount than those further away. Some of those reasons for impact might be the sound of the facility, the views of those facilities, the sense of change in the community that are more immediate than if you are further away and maybe less connected visually or auditorially to the facility. And so hedonic pricing models are used as a proxy to gauge whether the environment of home sales, that sort of fabric of home sales, has absorbed those impacts. And it's used for all kinds of amenity and disamenity research, so it's not novel to apply it to this question. But this research, by all means, is still emerging. And I'll actually talk about one of the major divergences of this research as it currently stands. So the work we did, we've done a number of studies along these lines from Berkeley Lab with other researchers. This one was focused on the state of facilities, all relatively small. We collected lots of data and looked at this suite of amenities and disamenities, including turbines, to try to better understand the impacts that are there and are perceived by those that are purchasing homes in those communities. In this case, there was the results seem to say that yes, people perceive the environment and they weight that into the value of the home, but they are not adversely or in any way that is statistically significant in measuring in or influencing the sale price of the home because of proximity to turbines. In this case, this is a half-mile away from turbines. So despite the presence of effects from other environmental amenities and disamenities in the same environment, we don't see that there is a strong relationship that is statistically significant for turbines. Now, this set of results comports with other U.S. studies that are along these lines that are the sort of the heavyweights of the studies, the ones that use large data sets and use more progressive methodologies, but it differs from the same studies that have been conducted in the EU, and I'm sure Claire is very familiar with those. And so one of the interesting things about this line of research is why there is a difference if we're applying the same methodologies but getting different results. And so I don't have any immediate answers for those. We have some theories, but that is where the research will probably end up going. In terms of broad-based economic analysis, the IO input-output model, which is one of the ones I mentioned, is a nice way to understand broad-based economic impact. That doesn't let you understand the local impact, which is what we had been focusing on, Dustin and Claire's presentation, but it does give you a sense of what might be the broad-based impact in terms of revenue and taxes and employment and that sort of thing. So some of the research that has been done focuses on that. There's another type of research which is more local, uses the same sort of idea. What are the broad-based economic impacts? One is measuring taxes, and in this case this is a measurement of taxes in counties where there's been a lot of wind development. Of course, wind developers bestow a good deal of benefits on those communities, and the assumption would be that it would affect the taxes. This is one study that was looked at that same issue. I really think this needs to be followed up. But one of the interesting things that came out of this study is also a look at the changes that occurred to local school quality based on some of those benefits that are bestowed to the community. And he found higher school quality, which means higher test scores or student-teacher relationships. Again, these are only part of this is only part of the equation. The interesting aspects of Claire and Dustin's presentation really looked at the community relationship to the facility and the perceived fairness of the process and how that outcome is affected by that perceived fairness. This really doesn't get at that. So I think they're really different, but they can kind of paint a broader picture. Last group of studies that have been done really focused in on the household, and this is for solar. So this isn't large-scale solar installations, but these are individual homes that are receiving solar. So some of our work is focused on the increase in value or the decrease in value or the measurement of any change in value based on whether a home has solar or not. And this is a small aspect of the overall picture of the development of solar across our countries. But this is an important aspect when one thinks about how to appropriately value homes with those. So I should say that some of the recent work you might be interested in, though it doesn't fit within community impacts exactly, is about looking at homes that have third-party owned solar systems and finding that at this point there doesn't appear to be any change in value of those homes despite the presence of that system. So that is it for me. I've rushed through it to give us time to talk here. We have about 20 minutes left, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for listening.
So thanks, Ben, and I apologize for mispronouncing your name. So this is Julia Haggerty again. I'm going to encourage everyone to go ahead and start typing in the questions that you have, and I'm going to exploit my position as moderator here to start with a question that I think works across your three very interesting presentations. So one observation that seems valid from especially the first two presentations is this idea that it may be the siting process that is as disruptive to communities as the actual infrastructure, especially over time. And certainly there's a lot of work in the electricity infrastructure research that shows that people pretty quickly kind of accommodate these things into their worldview. So it's that, the siting process that maybe is very disruptive. And I'm curious about this. Seems like a pretty clear difference in Dustin and Claire's examples about the opportunities for governance to create circumstances that enable really creative, fair, or just impact assessment processes. And well, I know a lot of the people that have worked in the clean energy advocacy space on the solar zone planning and the wind planning for federal lands in the United States some of that planning was sort of motivated by the need for an energy transition, right? So I see these trajectories working at odds. One is, let's get really good, fine-grained, very localized impact assessment processes that make the whole thing less disruptive. At the same time, let's do comprehensive planning to try to accelerate energy development. And that, to just draw in Ben as well, I also think this raises this question in impact assessment about whether or not we'll ever get to generalizable findings about, say, economic impacts of these various energy infrastructures because of the highly idiosyncratic nature of these landscapes. So I'll throw that long-winded question out for comments from our three presenters, and then we can take comments from the audience.
Hi, this is Dustin. I'm happy to start. I think my case, particularly the siting in the western U.S., is somewhat unique in the sense that the Bureau of Land Management has a mandate to install solar on public lands. And some of the things that I've tried to write about is how certain kind of institutional inertia basically led to the controversies we saw in this window 2008 to 2014. And I would actually argue that that window is shutting, meaning that we have, so real quick backstory, in 2001, there was an executive order to expedite the environmental review of any energy projects on public lands. And that kind of becomes a bigger issue later on. 2005, the BLM, through the Energy Policy Act, opens up 22 million acres to first come serve developers. And now moving on, actually part of the planning with the Renewable Portfolio Standard in California, which has really driven the utility scale projects, was the passage of this Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. So through these two plans, one of them is a programmatic EIS, which took the 22 million acres and focused it down to 300,000 acres. And the California plan has a little bit more acreage because they didn't just take the federal findings, they actually expanded it a little bit more. Now, I would argue that will obviate many of the future conflicts, because you'll basically be fast-tracked in those solar energy zones, and you got a bigger review if you go outside of them. Now, the challenge is that it's still about public lands, right? And that, to me, is part of what is fomenting many of these controversies, because the public lands are owned by all public. So in some ways, it's not even a local impact, because anybody who's, is a taxpayer is, ostensibly owns those public lands, right? So it kind of invites more people to comment. And as I pointed out during the talk, because these lands historically were offered to anybody to take them and develop them, because they were dry, they were not. The BLM got stuck with these. They tried to give them to states in the 1920s. Their mission historically was to dispossess these lands and give them away, but by default they became put into conservation. So in fact, they actually became very good quality habitat. So I don't know if that's answering the question per se, but there are institutions that have been built to help address these that I think actually make this somewhat of a controversial blip in the American West. And I do think that we're going to work through them in the future.
Shall I go next? Thank you very much, Julia. That was a really beautiful summary of some of the key things that we've covered so far, and you rightly talked about of there being perhaps something of a contradiction between, on one hand, talking about the need for meaningful local level assessment, and yet on the other hand, we need to have policy that moves us along. And I think there's a couple of things to say about that. I think firstly that the idea that renewable energy is so important, that the sorts of challenges that we're facing are so great that we need to just kind of get on with it. I empathise with that enormously, but I think what we've learned so far is that isn't enough, and that mistakes were made in the UK, certainly, by wind farm developers who just assumed that at the very beginning. So a lot of the early wind farms in the UK, there was very, very little public consultation. It was just assumed that, well, everyone's going to support these things, that they're good, we need them. And I think what's been found is that the time and effort that it takes to engage locally, to find out about local places, to find out why they matter and how change can perhaps be better absorbed, that time and effort spent earlier on in engaging actually reaps benefits later on. So less likely to be lengthy, drawn-out planning processes, going to public inquiries, dragging on for years. So though perhaps it seems like perhaps well spent earlier on. The second thing I was going to say, following on from something very interesting that Dustin was saying there about this idea of creating zones. The planning system that we have in the UK is very much about making most of the decisions quite early on and then announcing to the public, hey, we're thinking about putting a wind farm here. What do you think? And the public have very little opportunity to say very much. So there'll be a small amount of scope maybe to say, or, you know, can we have a couple less turbines, or can they be in a slightly different arrangement, but really very little. And the planning processes in countries across Europe are quite different. So in Germany, for example, the emphasis is on public engagement much earlier on about creating strategic areas that are suitable for wind farms and getting public consensus around those sorts of decisions well before any particular plans are laid out. And of course there's still protest in Germany, but it's a whole different way of thinking about how to plan for these sorts of developments, rather than, as we have in the UK, announcing everything when it's kind of fait accompli, it's already been decided that this is a good place for a wind farm. There's an alternative way of doing it, which is involving people much earlier on, which I think is much more effective.
Yeah, and I'll follow up on Claire's comments. Those are great. I mean, I think in the U.S. There is maybe absent of the issues related to public lands, this overall scenario where there's just more land with very few individuals, and so maybe for the first bit of our history in terms of development, we were able to pick, if you would call them, low-hanging fruit sites where there were very few individuals in contact. Not obviously none, but the relative amount of opposition given the amount of megawatts that are put in to the U.S. is really different than in the European context. But that is beginning to change. Development is occurring in closer and closer proximity to individuals, and as well we have a cumulative impact which is occurring. And so I think what we've been talking about today in terms of the process being more important from the outcome is slowly getting through to the developers, and in that they are trying, at least appears from us as researchers, that they are trying to do better in this area and have that contact occur as early as possible and often, and there's a sense of fairness and openness. It's by no means perfect, but it is moving forward. But I think one of the interesting things about the U.S. in terms of the structure of the development process is that right now it's really pitted against having another form of development that can be scalable. What I mean to say is that the tax incentives that are currently available are really available and useful to individuals that have enormous tax appetite, and that is not normally the case for a community-led project. And so a major portion of the driver of development in the U.S. has to do with the tax policy, and until that changes, we're going to be struggling to kind of produce different models that would be obviously a lot better for the communities in which they're put in, where we have community projects that are led by the community, and folks are offered incentives to participate if they want to. They have a say in the outcome, that kind of thing. So in the period between maybe that, if that is our future, and today, we have to just push as much as we can on the developers to do the right thing in terms of their development processes. Yeah, and then you asked about economic impacts of idiosyncratic siting. That's a great question. I know that property value studies at the local level are extremely difficult to do with accuracy and without bias. And so we don't have any immediate answers to that. One thing we might be able to do if we expanded the data sets across the country is look at relationships between impacts and different forms of land. Maybe impacts are different, and maybe different views of place in those lands. That work has not been done, but it is something that seems doable given the resources to do it. And of course, there are other economic impacts that could be studied too. But in terms of the property value research, it's pretty tough to do that at a local level and do it well with high degree of rigor.
Right.
This is Dustin. Real quick, if I can just add one more thing. Speaking to that tax liability issue and that the ITC, the investment tax credit, or the production tax credit for wind don't necessarily help. There was a program that called the Treasury 1603 program that operated for a number of years early in the Obama administration that basically flipped that tax rebate into about $10 billion worth of cash grants in lieu of the tax credit. So there are definitely examples of that out there. And if I could flag one more thing about land use, and I'll just be very California-centric here. This programmatic environmental impact statement I mentioned identified about 300,000 acres across the West. The Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, has identified about 1.7 million acres in California on brownfields, landfills, other sites, and these might pose environmental justice issues that we would have to look at too. But again, I think it really warrants evaluating kind of what's on the table and questioning whether we're being forced into a set of false choices about where we site projects, because I think there are certainly plenty of lands available to site and not have these controversies emerge, which end up costing developers money. So, yeah,
Okay,
I'm sorry
so
I interrupted.
I'm going to just jump in to make sure we can attend to a couple of the audience questions. And I think I'm going to put these two questions from Taryn and Mike together. Taryn asks about people who are resisting corporate control over energy around the world, and whether or not the speakers want to speak about whether and how people that you've researched talk about corporate control over renewable energy, and is the degree to which there is a corporate presence one of the reasons that these local discussions can be so conflictual. And related to that is Mike's question, which is whether you notice different perceptions or levels of acceptance of energy projects when renewable projects are smaller in the 1 to 5 megawatt zone or locally owned or community-based projects.
This is Dustin. I'm happy to talk on that first one because it actually did come up a lot. Because in the West and U.S. we're talking about huge projects. We're talking about projects that have 9 million solar panels on them, and that are like 3 miles by 4 miles on a side. When many of these early projects were funded early in the Obama public lands, they also were able to get these big Department of Energy loan guarantees, and in fact they used some of those Treasury 1603 grants that I talked about to pay off those loan guarantees. And if you actually look at the roster of major projects that were funded, you find they're owned by Citibank, by Morgan Stanley, by one was Morgan Stanley, BP, Chevron. So it was very clear from my interviews with people, particularly in that early phase, that this was, again, the context here is this is the middle of the financial crisis where banks are not lending money, yet you have banks going to the federal government and borrowing money for these renewable energy projects. So that was very, very clear in my work, that there's concern about the corporate, of basically making public financing that was set up through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act available, that was basically being gobbled up by big banks. So loud and clear, that was definitely present in my case studies.
Yeah, and I...
Go on, Ben.
Sure, Claire, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thank you. So I think these are really good questions, and the short answer is yes, the corporate issue matters, but it's not the whole story. So it certainly matters who has initiated the development, the way in which they've done it, and there's been a lot of controversy in the UK because the developer is very often not a UK-based developer. So we have French companies, German companies who own utilities here now, and that's caused a lot of tension. You may have heard about some tension, shall we say, with the UK and the rest of Europe. So there's been some issues around who has been doing the developing. But I don't think that's the whole story, and I'm really sorry about this. I'm going to do a terribly annoying academic thing and suggest you read a paper that happens to be one of mine. So I hope you don't mind. I'm going to put the reference in now. One of my postdocs and I have been doing some research looking at communities and looking at the way in which communities receive projects that have been developed from up and within that community, and certainly that is helpful. But it still matters whether that place is considered to be somewhere that's suitable and appropriate for the sort of project that's planned. So yes, it's a really big issue about corporate big interest developing on top of or not caring about a community. Developing from within a community certainly matters, but it's not necessarily the answer to all the problems. And I'm quickly going to paste that in now, and I'm going to hand over to Ben. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting because results of work that has not yet been published that we have conducted, which is a survey of individuals, randomly drawn survey of 1,700 individuals around the U.S. wind fleet, have found the exact same thing that Mike has mentioned or asked about, which is, do we see a difference in levels, sort of attitudes? Granted, there aren't the perfect metric, but attitudes of individuals around large facilities as compared to small. And we actually see a very clear relationship to their relative attitude as the number of turbines in their view increases. And so this is definitely the case. Ideally, we could have 1 or 2 turbines, not very far from people, and all the big ones much further away. We haven't quite figured out how to do that yet, but that is definitely the case. And so it's really important to understand not only large facilities and the relationship they have to the development process, but also cumulative impacts as more and more facilities are built.
So this is Julia Haggerty. Our wonderful hosts at the NCRCRD, who are partners, have alerted us to the fact that we really do need to wrap up. We've reached the hour. I can see from all of the discussion that's happening in the chat that there's a huge amount of interest in this, and this was a great convening. Really want to make sure we thank the audience. We had some 30 participants logged on, which is, I think, a great success, and I reckon those folks are from many different places and potentially even outside of academia. So welcome and thank you to our audience. This webinar, along with all of our webinars, will be available not only through the NCRCRD, but also through our own website, which is energyimpacts.org. I want to thank our wonderful presenters who did such a great job of distilling your wisdom into the greatest hits kind of version, and I think the topics really flowed together very nicely. So we hope to see all of you in July and along on our next webinar. Thank you all for attending. I'm going to close the webinar.
And this is Mark. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
It was a great pleasure.
Okay.